Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation. My name is Yael Zeira, and I'm the director of the Middle Eastern Studies program here at Syracuse University. And on behalf of the MESP and the Moynihan Institute, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event. We are meeting today at an extraordinarily consequential time. The U.S. Israeli war against Iran is the most significant military conflict in the Middle East in nearly a quarter century, one that has already inflicted immense human costs on ordinary Iranians and people across the region, and poses far-reaching consequences for regional stability, global energy markets, and the international order. There is no shortage of hot takes on this war, but what we need is serious, informed analysis, and we're fortunate to have one of the foremost experts on Iranian politics here to help us think through it today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to lay out a few quick ground rules for today's session. First, please use the Q&A function in the webinar to submit your questions. We are here to learn from our distinguished speaker, so please keep contributions focused on questions for him, not statements or comments. I will be moderating the Q&A and will try to get to as many questions as I can, prioritizing those that seem to resonate widely. As time allows, I'll read them verbatim and clarify only if necessary. Finally, as always, any questions containing hate speech or discriminatory or derogatory language toward any group will not be read or tolerated. It is now my great pleasure to present our speaker, Dr. Mehrzad Boroujerdi. Dr. Boroujerdi is Vice Provost and Dean of the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education at Missouri University of Science and Technology. Previously, he was Professor of Government and International Affairs and Director of the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. And prior to that, he was a Professor of Political Science right here at Syracuse University, where he was also the founding director of the Middle Eastern Studies program. So it's extremely special to have Dr. Boroujerdi back with us today. He is the author of a number of books, including Iranian Intellectuals in the West, Tormented Triumph of Nativism, the co-author of Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook, and the editor of Mirror for the Muslim Prince, Islam and Theory of Statecraft, which I happen to have right here with me in my office. Dr. Boroujerdi earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Boston University, a master's degree from Northeastern University, and a PhD in international relations from the American University in Washington, D.C. And he's also served as a fellow at a number of other institutions, including UT Austin and Harvard and the Middle East Institute in D.C. Finally, he's frequently consulted by government entities and national and international media outlets, including Al Jazeera, the AP, Reuters, The Guardian, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Post, and NPR, to name just a few. So Dr. Boroujerdi will speak for approximately 40 minutes or so, after which we will open up the floor for questions via the chat. But please do feel free to start submitting questions as they occur to you. Dr. Boroujerdi, thank you so much for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you all for the kind introduction. Thank you for the Moynihan Institute for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of colleagues at Syracuse and the Maxwell School in particular. So as you mentioned, the topic of the Iran war is very hot right now. And what I would try to do in the next 40 minutes is to share with you some of my thoughts about what's happening with the war, as well as its regional and global ramifications. And we try to leave ample time at the end for questions regarding negotiations or whatever people might have in their minds about this. Let me preface this by saying the following. I believe the events of October 7th the Hamas attack on Israel on that day, a terrible terrorist attack, really became a turning point in the history of the Middle East. In terms of its significance, I think we have to go and compare it to such other events as, the 1967 war, perhaps, between the Arabs and the Israelis. What we are seeing today is in many ways, for reasons that I will describe in the course of my presentation, a continuation of forces and the dynamics that were unleashed by the events of October 7 and the subsequent war between Israel and Hamas. Yes, this is really the most consequential conflict in the Middle East. When I was teaching my Middle East politics classes at SU, I would often start on first day saying, Middle East is no Las Vegas. What happens there doesn't stay there. And I think today we are beginning to see the impact of this thing in so many ways. This war has already impacted at least 11 countries, as I have counted, so far. And who knows where the chips may fall, by the time we are done here. So this is really not a war that is localized. It is sort of beginning to demonstrate a reordering of the regional power structure and the strategic alignments that are there. I want to first start about the legitimacy of the war and come out and outright say that I don't believe that this was a justified war. I think this was a war of choice and was ill-judged and, in my view, strategically rather inconsistent. I want to take you back to the White House National Security Strategy document that was published just 5 months ago in November of 2025, right? If people consult that document, you will see that Iran is mentioned only twice, and both times in the context of what a wonderful job the U.S. did during the summer of 2025 12-day war with Iran in destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities. So in other words, as of 5 months ago, there was no sense of any imminent threat from Iran, not even worth a single mention in the National Security Strategy document that came out. Furthermore, that document came about a few months after we had witnessed the 12-day war, where President Trump claimed that Iran's nuclear facilities, have been destroyed totally, etc. And therefore, there was no enrichment happening in Iran to warrant, this argument about an imminent threat from Iran. So, and I think what we have seen lately from the administration, that not being able to really explain the reasoning behind the attack speaks to that lack of a strategic consideration in terms of what exactly was the reason for wanting to go to war, or more importantly, what did one achieve? We heard from President Trump and his lieutenants arguments regarding, trying to extract strategic concessions from Iran, all the way to a regime change and futile hopes regarding regime change in the early days of this conflict. 3 weeks or 4 weeks into this conflict now, I think it's fair to say that perhaps there was some misreading of the Iranian state resilience. This did not prove to be a one-bullet state, right? This was no Venezuela, where you go and, in daylight, etc., capture the president and, things end and you have a leadership change that wants to now work with the White House. Quite the opposite. Iran proved not to be a house of cards. Surely it has the lower hand in terms of its military might, no contest with the U.S. and the Israelis' combined power, but nonetheless one capable enough of pushing back and extracting costs, which again I will try to explain in my presentation about what's happening. So let's look at it, this asymmetric conflict that we have in front of us, right? In my view, Iran's strategy is very simple. The strategy is to avoid defeat, not to win conventionally, because they know, keep in mind, Iran has no air force to speak of, right? Its fighter jets are F-4s from before the 1979 revolution. So they are no match for sophisticated, advanced F-35 fighter jets that the US has, right? And that's why we are seeing a complete dominance of the Iranian aerospace by the Americans and the Israelis in that sense. So, that's a given. That's a given from a military perspective that the Iranians realized very well. They saw, firsthand what happened last year in the 12-day war in terms of what these two powers can do to it, right? So they understood that and therefore decided that they want to pursue a parallel war that is centered on economic disruption, particularly when it comes to global energy markets. And the fact that they have a very important ace in their hands, the Strait of Hormuz, as a maritime checkpoint, was very important for them in this regard. So what Iran is doing, in my view, are four things that, when you think about it, they are not really quite irrational, all things considered. They are trying to endure sustained strikes. They are improvising tactically. They are retaliating selectively, and they are accepting risk. In other words, in my view, this is a strategy that aligns quite well with the doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, right? In other words, you raise the chips in the game to make sure if your interlocutor is going to blink first in this regard, all right? So imposing costs to force negotiations or to force restraint is what the Iranians are after. All right, so how are they doing this in terms of, this energy warfare that has been adopted? Okay, so in my view, Iran is sort of effectively weaponizing global energy flows, right? Just the simple threat to mine or close the Strait of Hormuz, where 20% of global oil and gas has to pass through every single day, has created this major global supply challenge that we are facing right now. Their promise to attack oil infrastructure, ILNG facilities, regional energy systems, etc., has all led to a rise in oil prices and supply shocks that can really only be compared right now to 1973, when OPEC decided to raise the price of oil fourfold, right? As we know, that event by OPEC was consequential in terms of all the search for solar energy and so forth and so on, creating a strategic, oil reserves, et cetera, et cetera. My sense is that if this conflict continues for a few more weeks or months, right, we might be looking at a similar crisis that is going to serve as a catalyst for some long-term structural shifts, meaning that this can lead to renewed investment in renewable energy. Nuclear power will become even more important. I will go as far as to say increased coal usage to bridge supply gaps will be something that will not be unheard of. Of course, electrical vehicles and so forth, popularity of those things is also going to be back on the menu again as a result of this thing. So repercussions can be great in this regard. All right. Now, I mentioned that Iran doesn't have the strong military, but there are some factors that are working to its advantage. Size is one of those things. Look, Iran is a country of 1.6 million square kilometers. Basically, it means it is larger than France, Germany, and Spain combined, right? So with a size like that, They are capable of having a strategic depth, dispersal of assets in this place, despite the fact that U.S. says so far they have hit 8,000 targets and the Israelis say they have hit 4,000 targets. Still, the size of the country has enabled them to stand firm, disperse their assets as much as possible, and show a degree of resilience against the air campaigns that they are enduring at this point in time. Furthermore, their ability over the last 47 years, the Iranians learned a very valuable lesson from the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq War. And that was you need to become more self-reliant, right? Nobody is going to scratch your back except your fingernails is the lesson that the Iranians learned from that experience. As such, production of missiles, drones, and so forth, in the absence of having an air force, became the logical thing for them to do, all this time here. Furthermore, they also benefit from a naval asymmetry, meaning, reportedly, based on what military experts say, Iran has between 3,000 to 5,000 mines that can be laid in the Persian Gulf. Therefore, this can be done by a small, boats, vessels, and as well as other, larger naval boats that the country possesses as of right now. So they have these limited assets that they are basically, in my view, are using a weak hand, right, as best as they can, at least so far in the game. We will see what happens, down the road. But so far in the game, I think they are accomplishing the type of things that they are after. Furthermore, they are aiming at something more important. They recognize that there is a difference between the Israeli and the American endgame here, right? There are gaps between these two states. Again, as anyone will learn in a intro to IR class, no two states necessarily have the same, unique, unified national interest. The Israelis have made it clear under Mr. Netanyahu that the aim is regime change in Iran, no matter what. For President Trump, the aim seems to be much more limited than that. If regime change could happen, fine, but he is also willing to take, a leadership change, a la what happened in Venezuela, as an example of a lighter version of success there. So the Iranians know that the longer the game is played, the longer this conflict goes, the gaps, the cleavages between the Americans and the Israelis is bound to increase, and therefore the issue of U.S. soldiers getting killed on the ground, etc., will raise more eyebrows in this country than it has so far in the game. So it seems to me that when it comes to looking at the balance between the two sides, Iranians seem to have a higher threshold of pain, right? Because remember, at the end of the day, this is also a very brutal state that we are dealing. A state that just this January 5th, right, and 6th, massacred 30,000 of its own citizens. So it's not as if we are talking about a democracy here. This is a regime that is capable of injecting pain into its body politic as a way of, a survival mechanism, right? So therefore, the threshold for pain seems to be, higher than what, the White House has to worry about what happens in the stock market and, what the Arab allies say, what the European allies are saying, and the like. Furthermore, in terms of time horizon, I also think that the U.S. operates on a shorter political and strategic timeline, right? Domestic pressures, economic sensitivity to inflation, energy prices here seem to be, more serious for the United States than it is for Iran, that is playing a game of long duration, right? They can play this game for a while because of that greater tolerance for hardship that I mentioned. So if you ask me, they also benefit from the following fact. They recognize that there is a cost asymmetry in this warfare. Iranian drones can cost anywhere between $20K to $100,000, whereas the interceptors and missiles that are being fired to bring it down can cost in millions of dollars. So you do the math in terms of what this can mean as this conflict continues for some time to come here. I want to move on to regional dynamics and then go to the international ones. So in regard to regional dynamics, there is really a lot to be said here. I think it's fair to say that after October 7 and what we see with Hamas and Hezbollah and now with Iran, Israel is trying to consolidate its position as the emerging de facto regional hegemon in the Middle East. And therefore, I think that's why they have more expansive war aims in mind than the United States at the moment. Please keep in mind that as we speak, the Israelis are fighting two serious wars. I'm not even counting, Gaza, right? They are simultaneously fighting Iran and fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. So much so that the casualties in Lebanon is 75% of the total casualties in Iran, right? Over 1,000 people killed in Lebanon so far, over 1,300 killed in Iran right now. And again, we are now beginning to hear this talk about, perhaps, having Israeli settlements in the southern Lebanon area. So again, I think the Israelis are being entrepreneurial and trying to take advantage of the facts on the ground, trying to change the regional dynamics to their favor in perpetuity going forward. Furthermore, Israel does not have the same type of sensitivity to global oil prices that the U.S. has. It doesn't have to worry about economic strains on Arab partners the same way Washington has because of all the U.S. investments, U.S. oil companies, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the like. Nor do they have to worry about the domestic political cycle, with the midterm election approaching in 7 months in the United States as well. So I think it's important then to keep in mind that, as the good old adage goes, allies can become liabilities when interests diverge. And we have to see when this divergence of interest, happens. Even last year we saw it, during the 12-day war, right? President Trump wanting to, end the war as soon as the B-2 bombers had carried down their mission, whereas Netanyahu was interested in continuing the war, but was told by his senior partner, no, guns are going to fall silent at this point. Okay, what about the Gulf Cooperation Council states, the GCC states, right? So these countries are being exposed to this war without really much agency. The conflict is expanding geographically into their neck of the woods. They are highly exposed to this conflict, yet so far they have been largely absent militarily from this conflict. The fact of the matter is that despite all the bravado that we heard from successive U.S. administration, the U.S. has not been able to fully shield these regional allies from Iranian missile threats, right? Look at a country like United Arab Emirates that has been on the receiving end of the largest number of missiles and drone attacks by Iran, right? The whole operation of United Arab Emirates, cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, etc., is based on what? Peaceful conduct of business, right? Commerce and the like. And now they feel that they have been, dragged into this conflict without, the White House listening to them in the first place when they were said, they were offering words of caution. And of course, now the Iranians are firing left and right at their, installations in these places. But the question is, what options do the Gulf states have? You see, for the longest time, their model of security has been the model of rent a superpower, right? The United States. But, and despite the fact that the U.S. protection shield has not worked as it was advertised, still the GCC states have few options but to continue relying on America for the foreseeable future. Where else are they going to go? Russia, China, etc. Doesn't seem quite likely. Now, if you're wondering why is it that these states are not getting involved in the conflict militarily, please keep in mind the following. If we set aside Saudi Arabia, the other 5 states of the Gulf Cooperation Council together, right, put together, their territory becomes 25% of Iran's territorial size. And they have 1/3 of Iran's population of 92 million, right? So these are small city-states, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, etc., right? And they know the facts of geography. Iran, as this giant neighbor next door, is not going to go anywhere. It will be there long after American and Israeli forces leave the region. Therefore, you want to be careful about how you conduct your relationships with Iran. I think that's part of the reason for their risk aversion, because they know, A, they are vulnerable to retaliation immediately right now. So, for example, latest report today was that the U.S. might be contemplating, with United Arab Emirates' help, a takeover of some disputed islands in the Persian Gulf between Iran and UAE. And the Iranians are saying, well, if that happens, then all hell will break loose in terms of how we are going to be attacking UAE there. So interesting cost calculations that people have in this regard here. Furthermore, it's a fact of life that these GCC economies are acutely dependent on stability, right, in this maritime checkpoint. After all, for countries such as Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, they have to ship 87 to 95% of their hydrocarbons through the Strait of Hormuz every single day, right? So they are definitely going to feel the pinch much more seriously than others. Or imagine the following. As many of you know, Dubai has become a major aviation hub to the tune of 95 million passengers passing through Dubai International Airport in 2025. So think about the scale of civilian and commercial vulnerability, the lost tourism revenue, right, that countries like UAE have to deal with in this regard. So in my estimation, the GCC countries are really facing 4 simultaneous fiscal pressures, right? A, they have the reduced energy revenues because of what's going on. They have declining tourism and aviation income. They have rising defense and security expenditures, right, that they have to deal with. And of course, the disrupted supply chain that it is bothering these states. So long-term ramifications for GCC states, their fiscal stability might be eroding. All right. And this might also undermine some of their long-term diversification strategies that they have been pursuing for so long. Now, of course, on the positive column for these states, they have dollars, they have investment funds, the like of which the Iranians can only dream of. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund is $941 billion. United Arab Emirates Sovereign Wealth Fund is $1.5 trillion, right? So long-term ramifications for Iran after firing at all these neighbors is the fact that the Iranians, even if the regime is not overthrown, they are going to inherit a bankrupt economy, a war-torn economy where many of its basic infrastructure have been damaged. And, you are really going to be at the mercy of many of these neighbors. UAE, for example, after China, was Iran's second largest trading partner. So how are they going to treat you after you have fired all these things at them at this one, right? But again, as far as Tehran is concerned, friendly neighboring policy means nothing if you are suffering from existential angst, like they are suffering right now in this regard. I want to say one other thing in this regard, and that is when we look at the region, we also need to learn some lessons and see really how sophomoric the thinking is that by decapitating Iran's leadership, you bring about regime change. I want to, remind everyone that U.S. and Israel, right, have been trying to diminish Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Hashd al-Shabi, the Iraqi Shiite groups, for years, if not decades. And still, all these four entities, right, all of which are not even nation states, right? They are, political dash military groups, whatever. Not a single one of these has been eliminated. Okay, so what gives us the arrogance to think that a country with the size of Iran, population, resources, a skilled manpower, etc., is going to fall like a house of cards after a few weeks of bombing? I think again this goes back to not understanding the country in any way, perhaps making the same mistake that Saddam Hussein made in 1980 when he invaded Iran, thinking that the country was in the chaos of a revolution and therefore, he could accomplish his goals. To cut a longer story short, he got, engulfed in an 8-year conflict there, right? So I think these are important things to keep in mind. In the interest of time, let me move on to some of the implications for global energy markets and international relations. So we all know that the war has triggered the largest global gas price hike in 30 years. Fuel prices are up at least 33%. This has been even worse than when Russia invaded Ukraine in terms of its impact on the oil market, which was around, fuel prices went up by 19%. Now we are talking about anywhere in the neighborhood of 24 to 33%, right? So significant volatility across energy and financial markets have come about as a result of this thing. More oil supply has been cut off during this conflict than during the 1970 oil shock, right? When the price of oil quadrupled, as I mentioned before. So this is really important. Gas outages exceed twice the volume Europe lost from Russia in 2022. All right. So this is really not a routine disruption. This is a system level energy shock that is going to take us some years to come to terms. When I follow, reports about what's happening in terms of structural vulnerabilities in the rest of the world, you look at Asia, a continent that gets 90% of its gas from the Middle East. Pakistan relies for 90% of its gas imports on the country of Qatar, right? So you can see why, for example, in countries such as Bangladesh and Pakistan, they are closing universities as a way of conserving power, all right? They are shortening work weeks in energy-constrained economies, all the way to Thailand, etc. So this crisis is unfolding ahead of the summer demand peaks, which is going to compound the stress on the system for us. Australia, right? Australia, 80% of its jet fuel will be exhausted if this conflict goes on for more than a month. All right. For Africa, the number is 23 days, etc. So shortages are really serious in this regard. And we see that even the releasing of oil from strategic oil reserves has not really managed to bring down the price of oil. And keep in mind that those strategic oil reserves were at 60% capacity before the war started. It's not as if they were at 100% capacity, right? So we were short to begin with, and now we are even lower than what it is. So, the question really becomes, what other, aces does the White House, has in its back pocket that it can introduce to try to control the price of oil in the global, markets going forward? Okay, so this is also quite interesting, also in terms of international law, for example, right? when Russia attacked Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the White House used terminology such as inhumane, barbaric, and so forth and so on, right, to describe what was happening, rightfully so. And now we are having the White House promise the same thing, and the Israelis, of course, already carried out an attack on Iran's South Pars, energy fields and so forth. So this can be really serious in this regard, and of course, it has created some ironic turn of events, right? U.S. basically lifting sanctions on both Russia and Iran so that they can sell their sanctioned oil as a way of bringing down the price. War makes for a strange bedfellows, my friends. All right, moving on, trying to again keep an eye on the time. All right, so I think this is also going to have a rather interesting impact for European countries in terms of where they stand. To really summarize this, I think one of the lessons learned, at least by the Iranians, from this war, is that they're not going to take Europe seriously anymore, right? Europe is really a non-player as far as they are concerned. It's not showing political, let alone military independence from the U.S., and therefore they think that if they need to reach a deal, have a negotiation, it has to be with Washington, and Europeans will follow suit no matter what, because they do not really have the stomach of their own to get involved in a conflict militarily or in other ways. But there are other countries that are far away from this conflict that are still going to be impacted. For example, I'm thinking of highly import-dependent states that are going to face disproportionate economic strain. Countries such as Jordan, Pakistan, Egypt, Ethiopia, that again depend on oil and gas or workers' remittances from this area as a way of supporting their poor economies. And again, these are all going to have serious limitations going forward in this regard. There is, of course, friction point. In my view, the Ukraine stands to be one of the biggest losers in this conflict from what's happening in Iran, right? Why? Because of all the military ammunition that could have gone to Ukraine, that is now has to find its way into the Persian Gulf theater of operation. And secondly, by these things such as giving the price of oil going up, which of course, with Russia being a major oil producer, it means more money in the coffers of the Russian state as a way of persecuting the war against Ukraine, in the long term. So when we say international politics is really global, when we say Middle East is no Las Vegas, there is the ripple effect. These are just some examples of how things are being done. Finally, let me end on this note. One is also concerned, as I know many of you are in the Maxwell School, about what this really means about international norms. This conflict is accelerating a sort of a breakdown in norms of international conduct. For example, targeting and assassinating political leaders in a different country has now become kosher. All right. What happens if the Iranians or another state engages in the same type of behavior, right? Are we down at a slippery slope now in terms of, giving a green light to these type of activities? Or what happens to international law? For example, the U.S. Navy sank an Iranian vessel near Sri Lanka, 2,000 miles from the core theater of operation. Basically, this ship was returning from a joint military exercise that the U.S. Navy was also involved in, right, in international waters. So is everything now okay to do in terms of international waters and what we can do in terms of, inflicting damage on the other side? normative inconsistency, as I said, in terms of what the Russians are doing in places like Ukraine. So in short, the rules-based international order, right? How credible does it remain in this day and age anymore? Or should we really, give up on that idea that, it's good for textbooks on international law, but in terms of reality of, realpolitik, forget it. Okay, final point is the following. I think this war is going to reinforce broader trends such as fragmentation of the international system, a declining confidence in international norms, in supply chain stability. Again, it takes a whole different lecture really to just talk about what lessons we can learn in regard to supply chain stability or disruption as a result of this. This can be a wonderful case study for graduate students to look at going forward. And also finally, predictability of great power behavior. If we are moving toward a more transactional, less rule-bound global order, what does it mean, right? So we know that, as we say in politics does not like a vacuum. Every time there is a vacuum, an entrepreneurial actor needs to step in, try to fill the vacuum. And now this war is creating ample geographies of opportunity, right, for these entrepreneurial actors, regional and international, to try to fill the void. All right, let me stop there and entertain your questions.
Thank you so much, Mehrzad, for that very insightful and informative analysis. We have a few different questions in the chat. So I will, again, read them and we'll look forward to your answers.
Okay.
So there are a couple of questions here relating to the impact on global energy markets and global markets more broadly. Maybe I'll read two of them together and then I'll let you answer. So there's a question, how likely it would be for Iran to charge a fee for passing through the Strait of Hormuz after this war settles down? And then another audience member wrote, Japan, South Korea, and many more nations will be significantly affected. The Strait of Hormuz is not only important for oil transportation, but also for food supply to the Arab states. Fertilizer, helium is a byproduct of gas refineries. I am wondering when the impact of disruptions in all these goods will emerge in the West.
Very good question. Yeah. So in regard to the first one, what we saw was that reports last week, or maybe the week before, that the Iranians charged $2 million and allowed one ship to sail through, right? And then this basically was articulated by a member of Iranian parliament who said, well, we are in a war situation, etc. Why don't we make that into a regular practice, that we can be, charging this fee, right? The same way, for example, ships that go through the Suez and the Panama Canal, are paying fees. Why don't we do, such a thing? Of course, this was not the practice, beforehand, right? Okay, so while in the context of political theatrics, I think it makes a good point for the Iranians to make this argument. I really don't see that as a viable, long-term alternative, right? If we look at the volume of ships that have to sail through this area, on a day-to-day basis, and the various destinations that they are serving, right? It becomes impossible, in my view, for the United States, etc., to allow Iran such a practice for the long term, right? Because besides the argument about extortion money and so forth and so on, this is going to create a degree of chaos and so forth in the shipping industry, etc., that I don't think they can stand. This also will mean that the presumption of such a scenario is that the Iranians are able to maintain the closure of the Strait of Hormuz for the long term. I'm no military strategist, but talking to the more educated folks about the topic right now, everyone is telling me this, if there is if a hierarchy of items worth looking at in terms of their significance, opening a Strait of Hormuz is number one by far, right? Because everything else really follows suit from that one. So I cannot envision a scenario where the US is going to resign itself to this notion of Iran charging such fees for the long term, which brings up the other interesting question. Well, what alternatives do you have, right? Boots on the ground. I mean, as we speak, right, there is discussion about 2,500 Marines being dispatched, to the region. All right. So, for the Iranians who have become quite skeptical of U.S. argument regarding negotiations, they think, the 5-day extension by President Trump was only a ploy to buy, time again for these Marines to arrive there and then occupy the Khark Island or the disputed islands, etc., as a way of pressuring Iran to open up the Strait of Hormuz, right? So, I think we will see the answer to this question over the next few days as this is becoming important. On the second question, yes, absolutely. I mean, again, it's a given. When the price of oil goes up, means everything having to do with transportation goes up. The fertilizers go up, agricultural costs goes up, on and on, right? Helium and so forth, etc. So it seems that as of right now, right, the U.S., again, due to the strength of the U.S. economy, some of these strategic reserves, etc., the U.S. has not yet felt the pinch the same way as many of these Asian countries, right, that are first in the hierarchy to be impacted, are facing, right? I think it's a matter of time before countries such as U.S. will come to feel it. But Asian, Australia, etc. I think these are the first. Of course, it will get to Japan, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, and so forth. In a matter of time. Keep in mind, however, that there are some exceptions to this rule. Right, the Iranians have invested heavily in their relationship with China, which is their largest trading partner, right? China purchases over 80% of Iran's oil, right? So if there is one customer they care about, it's China, period. Everybody else can go to hell, right? As far as they are concerned. Okay, another one that is important to them is India. Okay, India has also been an important player. Iran has followed this strategy of looking east, meaning forging alliance with Eastern, countries, China, India, Pakistan, Russia. That's why, it joined the Shanghai, agreement and the like, right? But again, as I was trying to mention, we are dealing with such a interconnected global economy in such an important region of the world, such as the Persian Gulf, that it's just a matter of time before, everybody, from Ethiopia to Australia is going to be feeling the pinch.
Thank you so much. And your response actually touched on some of the other questions in the chat as well. So it's a good segue for us. So you mentioned the possibility of ground troops, and we have two questions about escalation. One is really right on this point. It asks, the U.S. is reportedly sending 5,000 Marines to the region in anticipation of a possible ground war. What is the size of the army they would be facing, and do you see a ground war happening? And then I'll also ask one that is a little less directly related, but I think also pertains to this. There's a question, do you believe reports in the New York Times and others that suggest MBS, that's what they're referring to, the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, do you believe reports in New York Times and others that MBS is interested in U.S. forces pressing the war further? And indeed, this is not my question, but I read a report like that this morning as well. So I'm interested in your opinion.
Sure. Yeah. Very good. Okay. Yes. So again, the Marines are being dispatched. We are hearing different things. The Speaker of Congress was saying today that this is not necessarily to having put boots on the ground, but really for the Iranians to think about that, right? As a fear tactic, intimidation tactic that, okay, the Marines are coming and so forth and so on. Look, I am a skeptic by intellectual training, right? Therefore, I think the chances of us entering the second stage of this conflict, meaning the involvement of ground forces, looks good at this point. So I expect that this thing will happen in the coming days. In this question of what type of challenge they will face, the size of the Iranian military. Well, remember, Iran has two military, right? It has followed this model of parallel militaries. You have the Revolutionary Guards that number around 180,000 approximately. This is sort of the best armed unit of Iranian military establishment. Okay, highly trained, etc., etc. Then you have the regular army, where it's a draft army. Every 18-year-old boy needs to serve for 2 years in that army. The regular army, which numbers in millions, is much poorly trained, does not have the type of resources that the Revolutionary Guards have, right? They have not been really politically involved, in what has been happening in Iran lately because of their mandate of defending the borders and the like. Whereas the Revolutionary Guards have basically been the stormtroopers for the regime, both domestically as well as in terms of international operations. So let's say the Quds Force has been the extraterritorial, right, wing of the Revolutionary Guards carrying out, activities throughout the world in that sense. And keep in mind that both the Revolutionary Guards and the regular army have an air force, a naval force, right, and the ground forces. So both will be utilized in this way. The challenge, I think, is the following. I think if the U.S. were to occupy any of those Iranian territories, a scorched earth strategy will be adopted by the Iranians, right? Khark Island, for example, is Iran's most important physical asset. 90% of the country's oil passes through Khark Island, right? So if the U.S. occupies that, I don't see the Iranians saying, okay, you can hold on to our oil and do what you want with it. Bomb the hell out of it. Every pipeline, right? Drone attacks, missile attacks that can originate from northern Iran, 1,500 miles away, okay? So every U.S. Marine will be in range, in other words, okay? I think that's what I expect that they will do. Same thing, they will really bombard UAE, Qatar, etc., and go after high value targets, right? That will really inflict pain. Just imagine, if one of these attacks leads to the killing of 100 European expatriates living in Dubai, right? What type of frenzy will be happening in European capitals? Okay, so it is not, again, it's imbalance of power, but it is not as if one side has all the aces and the other one has nothing in its back pocket to present there, right? So it will be bloody. It will be bloody, etc. And I think again, we need to ask whether the political establishment in the U.S. really has the appetite at this time for a war of choice that ends up being really bloody, right? And it's not like a nice video game that you play in the comfort of your living room. On MBS, yes, I do believe the New York Times reporting. Look, the Saudis and the Iranians have been at a state of Cold War since the 1979 revolution, both claiming the mandate of leading the Muslim world, right? With, of course, different credentials each. There has been no love lost between these two sides. Yes, as a matter of convenience, expediency, there was a rapprochement between the Saudis and the Iranians a few years ago, right? And they are there. But, WikiLeaks documents demonstrated that the Saudis have been telling successive U.S. administration, cut the head of the snake, right? Meaning they were advocating for the Americans to bring about regime change in Iran for the longest time, all right? And indeed, if there is one country right now that I think might be able to join the war alongside US and Israel against Iran, if this thing escalates, it's Saudi Arabia. Okay? The Saudis can make the argument that Iran attacked our installations first, etc. It's an act of self-defense, etc., etc. And, again, Saudis have up-to-date machinery, etc., military hardware that they can bring to bear on this conflict, which again makes it even more difficult on the Iranians if they were to join. This is not to say that the Iranians will also remain silent, right? Remember, Saudi Arabia has a sizable 10% of its population are Shiites. They are located in the eastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the richest oil fields are located, right? And therefore, for the Iranians to cause mischief in Saudi Arabia will be part of their game plan, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. We are getting many more questions. We have a number of questions about negotiations, of course, and I will kind of again group them. So the first question is, what would need to happen to bring about productive negotiations between the U.S. and Iran? And then there's also a question about what is Iran's incentive to engage in negotiations this week? Looks like they have the upper hand in some aspects of the war.
Right. Okay. So, look, I hope this war comes to an end sooner rather than later. As I said, I don't really feel that it was justified in the first place. Tulsi Gabbard, the head of the U.S. intelligence, gave a congressional testimony just last week where she said the Iranian system is largely intact. So if we were under this sophomoric thinking that we were going to see a quick regime change, ain't happening, right? And we need to adjust, our expectations. So the question really to me is, what can be a solution, right, whereby both sides manage to save face, right? We know the mindset and personality of President Trump, right? He doesn't take defeat well, right? Even when his companies go bankrupt in New York, he denies that's even a fact, right? So you don't expect Trump to come and say, "Oh, we made a boo-boo, my mistake, we apologize, et cetera, et cetera." Trump needs to claim victory, right? Same with the Iranians. Look, you have just killed a big chunk of their political and military elite, right? And the country is facing its most serious existential angst of the last 47 years. They do feel that they have the upper hand, which might, sound crazy to us, right? But again, look at it, please, from their perspective. The perspective is that as long as there is no regime change, we have won. We are inflicting harm, right? So the bar is set high for them in this regard. Okay, so why is it that the Iranians are not in a rush to sign on the dotted line for a ceasefire? Because they are asking, what guarantee do we have that we wouldn't have chapter 3 of these type of attacks 3 months from now, 6 months from now, right? You attacked us, twice already when negotiations were going on, right? How can I trust President Trump? Look, our good friend at Maxwell School, Luke Riesberg, right, had done, all sorts of research on intractable conflicts. We are talking about an intractable conflict between, Iran and the U.S. So it has all the complexities, right, of an intractable conflict, for sure. One of the casualties of an intractable conflict is that there is lack of trust. The two sides do not trust one another, right? For example, the talk in Iran right now is that, we have heard all these discussions about the Speaker of Iranian Parliament being the interlocutor, and having discussion with J.D. Vance or maybe Rubio in Pakistan, right? Many in Iran say, don't do it. This is just a trick. They want you to come out from your hiding and kill you, assassinate you as well. Right? I mean, that's the level of mistrust, right? That you can't even get into a room to have a discussion, let alone who is going to be negotiating and giving away the store or not. Right? That's the level of sensitivity that exists there in this regard. So the trick, I think, is really in coming to terms with both sides saving face. Now, what we are seeing, however, right now makes me think that the cleavage between the two sides is too wide right now to reach a deal. The 15 points that President Trump has formulated, right, basically tells the Iranians no nuclear activity, no enrichment, nothing on your soil, no support for proxy forces, and you have to give up much of your missile technology, right? So, which are the same three conditions that the Israelis have been insisting all along. The Iranians will say, what exactly am I getting in return? A gentleman's promise that he will not attack me? Does President Trump even have the ability, as he has said, to lift all sanctions? Many of those sanctions on Iran, and there are over 1,000 sanctions on Iran, many of those sanctions have been ratified by U.S. Congress. Executive power by the president cannot do the trick. And, we know Iran doesn't have too many friends in the U.S. Congress, right, to be able to do away with all these sanctions. So, again, I don't think they are being just stubborn for the sake of being stubborn, right? They are saying, what exactly do you have to put on table that is, to my liking? So, they are playing the game of tough guy themselves. They have put 5 conditions on the U.S., right? You take away, you close down all your military bases in the region. You pay us compensation for every damage you have made, right? You lift all the sanctions. You acknowledge our right to enrich, and you acknowledge our right to own the Strait of Hormuz, right? Okay, great. Yeah. So 15 against 5 conditions, both a set of maximalist demands. And again, I understand, we are sophisticated enough to know a lot of this is posturing for domestic audiences on both sides, right, etc. What happens is not what is said in public, but what happens behind closed doors in terms of the give and take that has to happen, over the negotiating table. But having said that, still, the two sides need to reach that level of trust, comfort, etc., to be able to say, okay, I give up this, you give up this, sort of confidence building measures. One way that I can think about this conflict ending is really not an official ceasefire, but rather a de facto one, right? We have a de facto ceasefire. Then a period of time passes for some confidence building measures, right? The temperature in the room comes down from what it is right now. And then the two sides can try to ink an agreement. Insisting on an agreement right now or a unconditional ceasefire, etc., not going to happen.
Thank you so much. So that brings us a little bit toward domestic politics in Iran, and we have a question about that. And I also have some questions about that. So I'm going to
Sure.
abuse my position as moderator for a moment here.
Yeah.
But first, I'll read the question from the audience. And I believe this is from a friend. So I have not been reading names, but this is from Massimo Ramaioli. I hope I said that correctly. Who
He's a
says,
former PhD student of mine.
he says, greetings to Mehrzad from Morocco, and asks, do we have any sense of the internal domestic opposition to the regime? The people who fill the streets in January, do they represent a sizable portion of the Iranian population? Or in the West, do we tend to overestimate their relevance as political actors to overthrow the IRI? So I'll put that to you, and then I'll ask you mine as well. We'll sort of couple them. So I have two. One is sort of about elites, and one of them is about masses. So about elites, I'm interested to hear how the war has affected the relative power and influence of hardliners versus moderates or pragmatists within the Iranian regime. And on the mass side, I really would love to hear you talk about how the war has impacted public opinion in Iran toward the regime and other relevant issues. And I read
Mhm.
an article in the Journal of Democracy that argued that thus far the war has in Iran reinforced elite cohesion, strengthened nationalist sentiment, and redirected public attention towards security and survival. And I'm wondering to what extent you agree with that assessment.
Okay, great. All right. So yes, I mean, what really makes this whole Iran issue so fascinating is that, besides everything we have said so far about the international dimensions of this war, the internal domestic politics of Iran, which is really my cup of tea, right? That's what I have invested a good chunk of my life learning about. Is really phenomenally sophisticated and complex in this regard. Reducing Iran, as many of us do in the Western media, etc., to this caricature image of a land of crazy sword-swinging ayatollahs, right? I think really has had this, terrible impact of this caricature has been that we really haven't invested the mental energy and time to understand the nuances of a revolutionary state born through a popular revolution leading to the establishment of theocracy. Iran is a case of one in comparative politics, right? The first modern revolution that has led to the establishment of a theocracy, not the separation of church and state, but the exact opposite, right? So, and it has now a track record of 47 years. 47 years that has been, a combination of some successes, for example, uh, literacy rates have gone up in an amazing way, etc. Uh, uh, and yet, also a country that has experienced some really, really horrible things in terms of repression, censorship, right? As many of us know, over the last, 20 years or so, we have had at least three popular movements in Iran asking for change. The 2009 Green Movement, the 2020-21 Women Life Freedom Movement, and then what happened recently in December and January, right, of this year. So three massive events that brought millions of people into the streets to say, we don't want the Islamic Republic. We don't want your, theocratic state, your reactionary, viewpoints on women's dress and all sorts of things, right? So there is an internal struggle in the country, no question about it, right? What this war has done and what the regime has done really since last year has really contributed to a fascinating case of polarization in the country. So much so that many Iranians, right, to this day remain supportive of Trump and Netanyahu bombing the hell out of the Ayatollahs, saying, look, we tried as unarmed civilians to bring about change and we couldn't. Maybe we need foreign support, right? And they justify it as humanitarian intervention and so forth and so on to say that that's the way to bring about change, all right? And yet, going back to Yael's, the second part of your question, um, there is also, as we know, wars inevitably produce this rally around the flag sentiment, right? Because, again, it's one thing for the Iranian expatriate community sitting in the comfort of their homes in Europe or the United States saying, bomb the hell out of the Ayatollahs, right? It's something else for my mother or somebody else's, elderly parents, right? Having to deal with bombs dropping left and right around them, right? It's a different scenario. So I think we are seeing this debate in the Iranian community to this day, and there are advocates and partisans of both sides. I don't think either one really can be denied, right? This is an expression of the predicament that the country is facing right now in terms of this polarization that has happened. So yes, in January we saw millions of people come out, many of them shouting the name of Iran's the son of the late Shah of Iran, as their favorite opposition leader to come and take the helm. The problem with this gentleman is just like me. He and I have been out of the country for 47 years, right? You don't really have any street credibility or network on the ground, right? Organizational muscle that will enable you to do something. So it's great that people like you, that they think you're a cosmopolitan politician, etc., can speak few languages, etc. But Iranian politics is violent at the end of the day. If you do not have an organized force, right, you only get your 15 minutes of fame, in Western media, and that's about it, right? And I think that's where we are. A lot of people are coming to this recognition that war might not be the solution. I put myself in that camp, as I said at the beginning. I think there is a third position that can be adopted for many of us, that will say no to the Islamic Republic, because we know that what this regime stands for, but also no to war, right? And not be shy about saying that we don't think the war is going to help anything. To your other question, about the elites, right? So I say this really with a heavy heart. Indeed, this book, right, that I wrote, that I put my laptop on right now, has biographies of 2,700 members of the Iranian political elite. It's an encyclopedia of political elite in Iran, right? So I studied these 2,700 people for 2 decades to see who they are, etc. And now when I look at the people who have been killed and who has replaced them, unfortunately, in every single case, the person who has replaced them has been more of a hardliner than the other, right? The guy who became the head of the Revolutionary Guard, the guy who just became the head of the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, right? The NSC for Iran, right? These are most brutal people. Indeed, the secretary of the National Security Council, who just got the position, and the former head of that the secretary, and who was also a defense minister of Iran, both of these individuals were in a terrorist organization that assassinated my father, in the days leading to the 1979 revolution, right? So in one way, I feel fine that these terrible guys are getting what they deserve, right? But on the other hand, right, as a, when I put on my objective hat as an analyst of Iranian politics, I have to set aside my personal feelings, right? And I say, oh, damn, right? People who have replaced them have also been, hardliners, etc. So, again, it becomes a question of, you have killed the leader of Hezbollah, Hamas, etc. Has the organization mellowed out? If the answer is no, right? Why do we expect that the same thing will not happen in Iran? And indeed, now these folks will have a discourse of grievance going on, right? If until last year the conflict between Iran and Israel was a Cold War, right? A war of words, proxies, here and there, right? Below the belt type of thing. Now it's open confrontation, right? So now you have a whole new generation that is going to embrace this anti-Israel message, right? Because again of what they witnessed in the war, or the anti-American message, right? And it's going to resonate, unfortunately, for years and years to come. So as they say, beware what you wish for, right? And I think all those who are advocating for the war now, as this thing continues, we are beginning to realize, oops, it didn't end up the way we were told it's going to.
Thank you so much. I want to ask one more quick question about domestic politics, and then there are a few questions here about have more to do with kind of law and process and that kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
but so I'll just kind of again, I do want to ask this one from again, I'm apologies if I mangle these names, from Farzad Amiri. Um,
Mhm.
he asked, does will the Iranian people raise their voice again after they witnessed the killing of the Ayatollah didn't change the regime, or or will people go out again on the street to protest? So wondering about, the likelihood of a future movement here.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there is no question that look, we are not dealing with a popular regime in Iran. I think that that's a fact, right? The reliable public opinion surveys that we have seen throughout the last few decades really gives you the confidence to think that almost 80% of the public are against this regime. 20% are hardcore supporters. I don't know what the percentages are now in the in the condition of war. Perhaps pro-regime element has gone up somewhat due to the rally behind the flag phenomena. But this regime, in my view, remains unpopular because, frankly, from a political sociology perspective, three things have happened in post-revolutionary Iran that the Ayatollahs have no answer for. Right? Iran, after 79 revolution, for the first time in its history, has become a country where the majority of the population are educated. For the first time in its history, it has become a country where urban population has surpassed rural population. And thirdly, it's a population where the average age has vacillated over the last few years between 28 to 32 median. So it's a relatively young age population, right? So you put together this formula: educated, urban, young, right? In the language of political science, this translates to a revolution of rising expectation. And the regime, with its reactionary perspective, right, has no solution to these things. If you want to censor everything, if you want to force hijab on the ladies and so forth and so on, right, this is not going to make you popular. It's an uphill battle. So I have no doubt. That, maybe not now as the bombs are falling, right, doesn't make sense. But as the dust settles, right, Iran is going to be a country that, again, is going to be inheriting a bankrupt economy. Iranian currency is one of the most worthless in the world right now, right? Um, with sanctions and economic blunders, managerial ineptitude, corruption of the elite, etc., we are going to be these guys are going to be inheriting a regime, right? An economy, a society that is in dire need, not even to speak of all other problems like shortages of water and electricity that they have been suffering from. Naturally, this is going to fuel the politics of opposition. So I would not be surprised at all if 6 months, a year from now, again, people come to the streets, voice those type of dissent, and maybe thinking that now that the regime is weaker than it was before, maybe the balance of power can trip in their favor, right? Going forward in this regard, we have to see whether that's going to happen. But yes, look, I mentioned the rally behind the flag phenomenon, but we also know from history, right, that this is a temporary phenomenon, right? When the guns fall silent, people go back to their normal life. Again, the normal everyday complaint and grievances of everyday life, inflation, etc., unemployment, is going to become primary concern of the citizenry.
Thank you. So we have two questions here about processes or lack thereof, both domestically and internationally. So I'll read both of them. So the first is, can you say something about the U.S. policy process or lack thereof that led to this war? Did the National Security Council debate this? Did they consult U.S. government and outside experts? And then a second question on the global level, it's the question reads, it seems like our global system of checks and balances has failed miserably. Do you think following this war there would be any changes to the UN Security Council's procedures and USA President's power in any way? I don't think the rest of the world, including NATO, can live with such an unpredictable situation. Do you expect any changes?
If I can be blunt in regard to the second answer question, no, right? Look, I think that breakdown of norms, international norms that I mentioned, right? It predates this war, right? Again, just remember what President Trump was saying about Greenland, right? About fight with NATO, right? And these type of issues, the Liberation Day, the tariffs, and so forth and so on. I think, a lot of self-inflicted damage has been done, right? In terms of this sort of rule-based system, etc., that many believed in. I will be uh, surprised, right? If in the coming years, we don't see the Europeans trying to move toward a more independent-minded, policy than following blindly on the footsteps of what the U.S. says, right? This is not going to go away, etc. And I think now we will have, even when President Trump finishes his term, there is the issue of precedents that have been set, etc. And the Europeans need to come to terms with this type of realities, and not just in Iran. And look at again what Russia did with Ukraine, right? So this breakdown of norms, etc., is going to be there. Furthermore, who knows what else might happen? President Trump is already talking about next going after Cuba, bringing about changing Cuba, right? Where will this chaos end, right? And what will remain of international law norms, etc., etc. I would say that this dichotomous discourse, right, of sort of a civilizing West teaching others how to behave, etc., it really has shown its bankruptcy. And therefore, I don't think anyone is going to, pay any attention to the moral preachers, right, that are going to talk about, the wonderful values of Western civilization and how, everybody else in the non-Western world are, barbarians at the gate and those type of arguments. That's number one. On the U.S. policy process, again, I'm really say this with a as I said, heavy heart as well. When I was teaching my classes, right, I would always make references to such U.S. institutions as the Federal Reserve, as the military, right, as institutions that are sort of independent of the executive power and are able to do their job, along the lines of the checks and balances system. But what I have learned, right, over the last few years, watching what has happened, with the Supreme Court, what has happened with the military, with the Federal Reserve, right, is that you begin to realize that no, what happened with the January 6th events, right? You begin to say that no, these sort of sacred institutions that we thought are sort of the backbone, the pillars of the American democracy, are really as more fragile than we thought them to be, right? And so you ask about the policy process. Again, yeah, I am wondering, is there a single individual in the entire White House staff that is not a yes man or a yes woman, right? That is able to talk to the administration and not just follow the party line, right? And say, you might be making the wrong decision, in regard to this thing, or have you really thought about this one, and so forth. Again, at least so far, from what I have heard, besides consultation between US and the Israelis, there is no evidence that anybody else really was, in the game as far as this war is concerned, right? The Europeans were left out, the Arab states were left out, or even when they were informed and they, protested, right? And saying, for example, UAE or Qatar saying, look, this can happen to us in retaliation, right? There was no one willing to listen to them in this regard. So I think these are some of the challenges that we see in terms of the policy process. Experts, you mentioned talking to experts. Again, as somebody who has been going to Washington for a long time, right? My experience is that depending on the administration, some administrations are willing to listen to outside voices, not having the echo chamber stuff. Others only are interested in having cheerleaders. So if you do not follow the party line, you don't get invited back for a session, for a discussion and going on. And so even the expert community that is in the beltway and gets listened to might be more limited in terms of their access and who listens to them than we think.
Thank you. We are nearly out of time, so I'm going to kind of take the essence of this last question and also combine it with one, and we'll have that as our closing. So there's a question here about the media and the accuracy of media reporting on this conflict, as well as how that's kind of impacting the conflict itself. Um, and then I was wondering if perhaps after you answer that, if you have any suggestions for folks in the audience who want to follow this conflict, about good outlets to follow or particular voices to follow, other scholars, if you can kind of give us a few resources for those of us who want to dig a little deeper after today.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, for staying informed, right, for my own, line of work, um, I have really come to trust a few, media outlets more than the others. My go-to one is always BBC. I find their reporting to be much more nuanced, much more, sort of informed by historical facts than the CNN and Fox type of news reporting that frankly I cannot stand for more than 2 minutes in that regard. If you want to see alternative voices, again, look, they say the first casualty of war is the truth, right? So there is censorship going on, reporting of what's going on, etc. The imagery that I see, let's say in CNN, and then I see in Al Jazeera, right, are really between day and night, right? So, for example, the damage done by Iranian missiles hitting Israel, right? The pictures you get from Al Jazeera is quite, you know, um, different than what you get in the more, I don't know what's the word, cleaner version, censored version, whatever that, American media is reporting. So at the very least, really, I think exposing ourselves to some alternative news sources outside the U.S. Might be the way to do. Indeed, by the way, to my days at Syracuse, right, when I was teaching a course on representation of the Middle East, this was one of the exercises. We will have students follow a news story, based on American media and non-Western media, right? And then, be able to come and report on it about the differences that they see, the type of guests that get, invited, the voices that get aired, and and the like. In terms of outside voices you can listen to, look, I think Twitter is now really maybe the best area for following some, good analysis or links and so forth to people who know what they are, talking about. There is a gentleman, I'm trying to remember, I was at a panel discussion with him at a forum in Vienna, Austria yesterday. Let me see. Okay. Yes. His first name is Danny. Last name is Citrin Owicz. He was the head of the Iran desk at the Israeli intelligence unit and extremely well informed about what's going on in Iran. There is a gentleman by the name of Ali Vaez, Vaez, who is an Iran person at International Crisis Group. He is also very good. And then there is a gentleman at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace by the name of Karim Sajjadpour, Sajjapour, I believe, who is also quite good in terms of following Iran stories on Twitter.
Thank you so much. We are actually out of time, we're a little past time, but it was, very, very engrossing. Most of our participants have stayed with us through the end. So a big thank you to Dr. Boroujerdi on behalf of the MESP and the Moynihan Institute and all our audience members. We all learned a lot, me included, and I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.